On today's episode of Let's Talk Drones, we are going over the camera performance on the DJI Air 3. This camera has been the topic of a lot of controversy for a lot of people since we saw that leaked spec sheet that indicated the sensors were going to be smaller than we had anticipated and speculated on up to that point. So now we're going to find out, is this camera the real deal or did it fall flat? Without further ado, let's talk drones. What's up? It's Chris, the Drone Geek, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Drones. Let's Talk Drones is brought to you by The Droning Company, the #1 online resource for commercial remote pilots based in the United States. Make sure you check them out online at thedroningcompany.com and across all major social media platforms. So today we are looking at the DJI Air 3's camera. Now again, this was the topic of a lot of controversy when we saw the leaked spec sheet because everybody was thinking, oh crap, we're not gonna get a 1-inch sensor on the DJI Air 3. Instead, we got two 1/1.3-inch sensors, and that caused a lot of concern about what the camera quality would be like on this drone. It really caused a problem when people were trying to imagine how the Air 3 would outdo the Air 2S. The Air 2S has that 1-inch sensor and has a max video resolution up to 5.4K. I've used the Air 2S myself in Alaska, and I have to attest, the image quality on that drone was fantastic. So when you say that this drone is going to have a smaller sensor on both cameras, you start to wonder, will it be able to keep up with the Air 2S, or is this going to be a big waste of money? But just when the doubt in the DJI Air 3 and its camera performance came to a peak, that's when it released. And that's also when a lot of our favorite YouTubers released their initial reviews on the DJI Air 3, particularly some of the specs on the camera. They also shared with us the new technology in the camera for the DJI Air 3. That stacked sensor technology that you may have heard about, and if not, I'm here to fill you in on. So if you're not familiar with what a stacked sensor is, I wasn't before actually purchasing the Air 3. Essentially what they do is they take the components of a standard sensor and layer them on top of one another. And what this does is it allows the camera to process imagery at lightning speeds. I'm talking super fast. And on top of that, it also generates higher quality images with less noise. Don't ask me how this is achieved because people much smarter than me were the ones that figured out that technology. That's just what I know about stacked sensors, and that's the type of sensor system that we have in the DJI Air 3. So while it may be smaller than what we anticipated, it certainly does have a chance to perform at a higher level than we've ever seen before. But now that we have the Air 3 in our hands, we can actually see for ourselves, what is this camera capable of? Before we get into what I found with the Air 3, let's take a look at the baseline specs for this camera. The DJI Air 3's camera system has two 1/1.3-inch CMOS sensors using that stacked sensor technology. It boasts a wide angle and 3x telephoto camera. It's capable of shooting both 12 and 48 megapixel photos. It's able to shoot both RAW and JPEG photo formats. Its max video resolution is 4K at 60 frames per second. It's also capable of frame rates up to 200 frames per second in slow motion mode. And it also shoots in normal, HLG, and D-Log-M color profiles. So let's start with photography performance for the DJI Air 3. Now this can shoot in both 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratios, which means in 4:3 you can get the full sensor processing your images, and in 16:9 it crops in on the sensor just so slightly to create that landscape effect. In both the 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratios, you can switch between 12 megapixel photos and 48 megapixel photos. And as I understand it, when you shoot in 12 megapixels on the Air 3, you're shooting true to form. That is what the camera is capable of. When you upgrade to 48 megapixels, it's essentially digital processing that happens in the camera that ups the resolution and allows for finer detail in the image. Think of it as sort of an upscaling your image in the camera and denoising it at the same time. A lot of people are adamant that shooting in 12 megapixels is the way to go because it gives you more flexibility when editing because there's been no processing done to the image file. I, on the other hand, think in the vein of work smarter, not harder. So why would I shoot in 12 megapixel when I have 48 megapixel available to me that'll do a lot of the cleaning up that I would normally do in Lightroom. Plus, when I run images through Lightroom, I can also run the denoise program on top of the 48 megapixel processing that was done in camera and get an even crisper and cleaner image. When you compare the 12 megapixel to the 48 megapixel side by side, it's pretty clear that the processing does a lot of work. Where it becomes apparent is when you actually get up close and personal with the images. Now, when we zoom in on this picture of this bridge and we look at the finer details of the bridge, you can really see the work that the processing did to the photo. It's much sharper and cleaner in the 48 megapixel version versus the 12 megapixel version. The principle remains the same when using the telephoto camera, which has a 3x zoom and creates a depth of field on your image. When you're shooting in 12 megapixel, it's definitely a raw image, but as soon as you put it in 48 megapixel mode, it does a lot of processing on the image and allows you to skip that part when in post-production. You'll still have the same flexibility with raw photo files in both the wide angle and telephoto cameras, but you don't have to worry about going through and sharpening your photo. You don't have to worry about going through and denoising your photo or anything of that nature. But on the note of that telephoto camera, can we take a minute and just recognize how cool the parallax effect that it produces is? It's absolutely fantastic for a drone in this category. The depth of field it creates and the body that it gives your photos is absolutely extraordinary, especially when you consider the sensor size and the components in this camera. It blows my mind that this isn't an optical zoom. And I gotta say, shooting telephoto photography with the Air 3 might be my dark horse favorite part of the Air 3. The images this produces when shooting in telephoto mode, again, mind-blowing. I can't stop raving about it. Is it the best that I've ever seen? No. But is it definitely worthy of professional photographers? Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of still photography, let's talk about panorama mode on the Air 3. Now, they didn't pack a lot of new stuff into panorama mode. In fact, I don't think they packed anything new in panorama mode. But what I do really like about panorama on the DJI Air 3 is how quickly it stitches the image together in the drone itself. With my Mavic 3, I usually have to wait several seconds, I don't know, maybe between 8 and 12 seconds usually before it stitches the whole thing together. With my Air 3, I wait between 3 and 5 seconds, and I've got a panorama just like that. At the end of the day, it truly does not matter what format you shoot your photography in with the Air 3. No matter how you shoot, whether you use auto exposure or manual exposure, whatever the case may be, you're gonna be able to run most of these photos through post-production programs like Lightroom and Topaz and be able to denoise them and sharpen them and get the dynamic range that you really want out of your photos on them. It all starts at the camera though, and its ability to process the images in a way that allows for the most dynamic range and the most flexibility when editing. Now, my favorite part, video. Let's talk video on the DJI Air 3. I've noticed right off the bat that the Air 3 chews through video. I mean, it processes it so quickly and it's buttery smooth. When you're shooting at 4K 60, you know that the video clips are gonna be smooth, but there's something about the video that comes out of the Air 3 that's just a little bit different, and I really enjoy watching it because it's mesmerizing how smooth the footage is. You get a fantastic amount of detail, it's high quality, and you get very little noise in the background of your video clips. It also shoots in 3 different color profiles. Of course, we'll start with the normal profile, the DJI Color Science. This is absolutely fantastic because it's true to form and the dynamic range on it is already good to use right out of the camera. I really enjoy shooting in normal mode with the Air 3. It's maybe my favorite, but there is one other contender that we'll talk about here in just a few seconds. It also shoots in HLG. Now, I'm not a huge fan of HLG myself, but if you like very vibrant colors with a lot of range in the contrast, HLG is definitely the way to go for you. Especially if you like to shoot in environments that have a wide variety of colors displayed, definitely like tropical settings, yeah, HLG on the Air 3 is the way to go. But the one contender that I have to shooting in normal mode is D-Log-M. For the first time, I can actually say I had genuine fun grading footage in post. It was an absolute joy to sit down at the editing computer when I was dealing with footage from the Air 3. Another aspect of the Air 3's video modes that sets it apart is its portrait mode. Now, a lot of us were disappointed when this didn't come out with a camera that rotated 45 degrees to allow for true portrait mode, which would mean you get it in 4K 60 because all they'd be doing is physically turning the camera and shooting in portrait mode that way, much like the Mini 3 and Mini 3 Pro do. This is a digital crop system for portrait mode, but the resolution on the digital crop is still 2.7K. and it's 60 frames per second, so you get a ton of flexibility when it comes to cropping in and slowing your footage down. It's perfect for social media, considering most social media platforms have a max resolution tolerance of about 1080p, even in portrait mode. You have a tolerance of about 25% when editing in post to crop in on your image to make sure you're framing up exactly what you want to frame up. There wasn't a huge change in terms of slow motion modes, but I did appreciate the modes that were available to me. You could shoot in 4K at 100 frames per second or 1080p at 200 frames per second or 100 frames per second. While I don't personally see the need to slow down aerial footage, I can definitely acknowledge that some people might want to slow down their aerial footage, and I can also appreciate the fact that this isn't just an aerial imaging platform. You can use this as an on-the-ground camera, essentially a floating tripod. So if you're shooting something that requires a close-up shot and you want to put it in slow motion, you could feasibly do it with a camera like this. And before we get to a summarization of my thoughts and feelings on the Air 3's camera, let's talk about a category of performance that a lot of us pay attention to, and that's low-light performance in drone cameras. Now, it's no mystery, low-light performance is hard to achieve with smaller sensor sizes. The Mavic 3 came out with that 4/3 sensor and sort of broke the ceiling open for low light performance in drones. Before that, it was the Mavic 2 Pro with its 1-inch sensor. This, however, does not have either one of those sensors. It has a smaller sensor, again at 1/1.3 inches. So there was a lot of scrutinizing about whether or not this would be capable of shooting in low light. And I'm here to report to you happily, this performs just fine. So let's look at the photography capabilities of the Air 3 in low light settings. First of all, when you're using the wide angle lens, you have to remember that the aperture is open more than it is on the telephoto lens. The wide angle lens has an aperture of f1.7, while the telephoto lens has an aperture of f2.8. When I had it set in auto exposure, which means that it determined the ISO as well as the shutter speed for me, that's when I found that it did okay and it gave me a pretty good image in low light conditions. But really what I needed to do was put the burden of exposing the image on my own shoulders. And when I did that, I found the sweet spot for both the telephoto camera and the wide angle camera. Let's start with the wide angle camera. In the setting that I was in, which will vary from the ones that you will be in potentially, I found the sweet spot was an ISO of 400 and a shutter speed of 1/5. Now, when I was using the telephoto camera, it was a little bit different. The exposure values that I had set for the telephoto camera were an ISO of 400, but my shutter speed was 1 second. When I manually set the exposure to these values, that's when I saw the true potential of the Air 3 in low light conditions. I got some absolutely fantastic photos that I was able to run through post and improve even more. You'll see in this wide shot with the wide angle sensor, I got lots of detail as well as a great dynamic range between the light and dark areas in the city during this low light shoot. When I ran it through Lightroom afterwards, I was able to upgrade it and make it look even better with a better dynamic range as well as less noise and a sharper profile. Same goes for the telephoto. When I had these settings set this way, you can see that the up close shot of the Genetti Hotel is absolutely beautiful right out of the camera, but then when we run it through Lightroom, it gets even better. Now, shooting video in low light mode was a different story. It wasn't necessarily all bad, but it was a little bit harder to get quality imagery out of the camera when shooting in video mode. Overall, the camera holds up well in low light, but the problem that I ran into was the lack of flexibility in the shutter speed. Now, this isn't uncommon for video recorders and for video cameras on drones specifically. However, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more variability in the ISO, and of course, having a variable aperture on the camera would have helped a lot too. Max ISO was 6400 and the max shutter speed was 1/60th of a second, which made it hard to shoot video in low light conditions. You could do it and it was still really good, but it wasn't quite up to snuff with where the photography performed. But that, my friends, is where DJI's proprietary night mode comes into play. This low light video mode from DJI maximizes the dynamic range in your video and minimizes the noise in it, so you get a higher quality picture without sacrificing any of the dynamic range. Now, the only downside to using DJI's night mode is that you do lose variability in both your color profile and your frame rate. You're maxed out to 4K at 30 frames per second second, and you can only shoot in the normal color mode with DJI's night mode. But if you're somebody like me who already likes DJI's normal color profile, that's really not a problem. The only thing you have to get used to is that lack of frame rate, and 30 frames per second still isn't bad. Aside from that though, night mode delivered big time for me, and it made shooting video in low light conditions with the Air 3 a little bit more practical. So, let's summarize my thoughts and feelings on the Air 3's camera performance. Overall, I was extremely pleased with the camera quality on the Air 3. I think that it definitely debunked all of the speculation and all of the criticism that it faced for having those 1/1.3 inch sensors. They perform extremely well, especially paired with that stacked sensor technology, and I think that if you buy this drone for photo and video purposes, you're really gonna love it. Now, would I use this as my main workhorse for aerial imaging via drones? No, I wouldn't. And there's a few reasons for that, namely how inflexible it is in some areas. And the thing that I'm thinking about most is in your ability to easily expose images. Now, the auto exposure settings on this are pretty darn good. I gotta say, I was pretty happy with the images that came out of the drone when I just set it on autopilot as far as exposure goes. When I had to do things manually, it was difficult not having a variable aperture, and some of the shutter speeds and ISO settings just weren't what I needed. So if you want to buy this and you plan on using it as your workhorse drone, the main drone that you use for client work, I would highly recommend that you purchase ND filters, and as many as you can at a variety of different f-stops. Because if you don't, you're gonna find yourself in a situation at some point down the line where it's just too bright in the setting that you're shooting, and it's hard to get a really high quality image. However, would I use this as a backup? Absolutely. I would certainly keep this in my bag as a backup because it will perform and it will put out professional quality images, especially if you're in a pinch. Where I really see a lot of value in the Air 3 is for content creators and for people that are making content for social media. So if you're doing something that doesn't require a high level of detail or certain shooting modes or certain frame rates or certain exposure values, you're not shooting for projects and for client projects that really need fine details ironed out, this is definitely a great option because it's going to give you professional level imagery on top of a really easy to use system. Not to mention, portrait mode is perfect for social media creators. If you're looking for a drone to implement in your social media content, look no further. And just so I'm totally clear, you could use this professionally. I don't want to knock it too hard because the image quality on it is fantastic. I would just be careful which clients you use it for. If you're doing a lot of real estate and things that are going to be posted on the internet and social media, yeah, this is all you need. But if you're gonna be shooting for documentaries, or you're gonna be shooting for small films, and you're gonna be shooting for projects that require a fine level of detail on the camera settings, this one might not be for that application. You might wanna go with something like the Mavic 3 Pro, for instance. But what do you think? Were you impressed with the camera performance on the DJI Air 3? Let me know down in the comments below, and if you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon down below. It gets this video out into the algorithm to more viewers like yourself, which helps this channel grow. If you really like this video and you love drone content made by drones, about drones, and for drone pilots, this is the channel for you. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and while you're at it, hit the bell icon too. It'll give you a notification every time I post a new video. Until next time, I'm Chris. This is the DJI Air 3. We're out of here. See ya. Yo, what you